MPs at Westminster are going to vote on passing assisted dying law. I still don't think we've got to grips with how assisted dying could go wrong here in Britain. What does that look like, and how can we protect vulnerable people? I wanted to look through at some of the recent history of assisted dying, and I couldn't really believe what I found in the archives. I met Chelsea recently, who didn't know any of this. I bet you don't know any of it either. I think it's all been forgotten, perhaps quite deliberately. And I just want to tell you about what happened in the 1980s when the assisted dying movement became a comfortable home for killers. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of people who were heavily involved or who were affected by the movement for assisted dying in the UK. And they're mostly stories about men, because the women are dead and did not get to tell their stories. It's campaigning, and this is going back to 1980 in Dundee in Scotland. Called Christina Hunter is rushed to hospital, and her husband, who is a retired police officer, has subjected her to a terrible violent assault. He has used a hammer and an axe, and he has strangled her, and he is obviously arrested and taken to court. And she had been suffering from senility, what we now call I suppose dementia, but she was wandering from the home. She'd been suffering for a few years. She was 79, so she'd been suffering since her 70s, and she was clearly obviously not terminally ill, but her behaviour was reported as being very challenging, and it was said that it was time for her to go into a care home. This was the trigger. Right, and so he is originally prosecuted for murder, but is allowed to plead guilty to the Scottish type of manslaughter, which is called culpable homicide. And he is actually sent to prison because the judge says he is worried at his self-righteous attitude at this abominable act on your wife with no remorse whatsoever. And all the headlines say things like, husband felt that death was a kindness, husband jailed for mercy killing. But this is 40 odd years ago, so it's quite it's a long time ago, right? But it's already the kind of language that we hear in mercy killing cases. I think is what happens next that's really, really interesting, because a man writes to the Scotsman newspaper in Scotland, and the Scotsman is like our big broadsheet, and he is called Nicholas Reid, and he runs an organisation called Exit, and it's a campaign for voluntary euthanasia. And he writes to the Scotsman and says, this is clearly a case of a compassionate case of a mercy killing. It's the first time in 4 years that anyone found guilty of this offence has actually been sentenced to prison. In the 12 other cases, it had always been 2 years probation or a conditional discharge. So that he is obviously all over this. Exit, his organisation, intends to see that Mr. Hunter is released as soon as possible. And I thought, wow, so already, like 1980, you've got this campaign group who are looking for euthanasia in the law to be lawful, are also campaigning on mercy killings, and are campaigning for this man who's horribly killed his wife, who the judge was really concerned about. They're campaigning for him to be freed. I thought that was really interesting, because 40 years later, people in the feminist world thought that these mercy killings were acts of kindness in a desperate situation, and it wasn't right that we prosecute them for murder. And when I pulled out all the data a few months ago and found that, like, overwhelmingly it's men killing women who are not terminally ill. Men are often very respectable. They are often police officers, and wherever you find an out in the law that allows you to get away with a crime, you'll find police officers. So I found that really staggering, that this kind of messaging was already being worked on, and that actually, the thing that's really surprising to me, this treatment of these men who kill, terribly violent killings of women, like, they get off 2 years suspended sentences, we would now say, and that was already the focus of the campaign in Exit in 1980. I think that's like
sinister. It's very sinister, and it unfortunately it doesn't surprise me that much. That language around, she would be better off dead. It's the most kind and compassionate thing. It often veils a real lack of care for another human being's life, and that's. Even just the violence with which that man killed his wife probably tells us a whole lot about what was actually driving that death. And it sounds like the Exit group would probably say that euthanasia would be a kinder way for her. She should still be dead, but wouldn't it be better if voluntary euthanasia had been available to him instead of a hammer?
Well, yeah, but why? Why are you campaigning on this when supposedly voluntary euthanasia is about terminal illness? I want to go on further to later that year, because what happens next is really interesting. So Nicholas Reid of Exit says that he is, at the very highest levels, making inquiries to see if there are other ways to help him with his case. Like, they are on it, right? And what happens about 6 months later is that Robert Hunter is released from prison. His solicitor argues that society's disapproval has been served by him serving, it was 6 months in prison, and he pretty much disappears from the record forever. He's not someone that is in the story any further. But the person who is in the story is Nicholas Reid, because Nicholas Reid is about to go to prison. So Nicholas Reid is Labour councillor, Oxford history grad, and he leads this organisation from this office in central London. They are very well connected though, like Lord Beaumont, who chairs the Liberals, also Press for Change, the trans rights group who've achieved huge change in the UK, is the chairman. So they are very, very well connected. They have former Nobel laureates as their general secretary. I mean, they are in the midst of Westminster. And I don't doubt that lots of what we think about mercy killings now is due to their campaigning. I mean, that's my firm position, is that we think the way we do about these killings because of their campaigning. But Nicholas Reid is about to be arrested in the suspicion of being involved in the deaths of 250 people.
Wow! Oh my gosh! In terms of euthanasia, he's been
aiding and abetting suicide is under the Suicide Act is the charge. But he and his henchman, who also works, who's described as a one-eyed man who works in the basement.
Oh my God!
He's actually arrested. He's arrested from a charge of murder and multiple charges of aiding and abetting suicides.
So were they doing it in their basement? Were they just it was illegal and they just kind of had a bootstrap euthanasia program going in there in the darkness of the basement from this one-eyed man? I mean,
he was working in the basement. He was actually just doing, I think he was just the janitor.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I misunderstood. I was like, this sounds like a movie.
I mean, this is the thing, right? I mean, I just put yourself in the position, you're running this organisation, you're you're campaigning at the centre of government, the bloke in the basement who does the radiators, you think, I have an idea. Why don't the two of us get together and offer a service to the British public? And so what people would do is, the news stories at the time are shocking. I'm going to try and put as many as possible on our site. But if you got in touch with this organisation, Nicholas Reid would speak to you by phone. And if he felt satisfied, he would sort of triage you for suicide. / let's be honest, it's a bit more than suicide. And he would send this bloke out to see you. And this bloke, he's described as a madman, one-eyed terror. But he's basically just this bloke who worked in the basement, and he's
not a doctor.
No.
Wow, this is like Harold Shipman, but worse.
Come on. I mean, this guy is long dead, but it's a mass killing. Is that? I think I can say that. And he goes out to these people's houses and he takes kit with him. And one woman who was disabled felt extremely low, and someone told her to get in touch with Exit, and she did. And she then spoke to someone else who cheered her up and who made her feel okay again. She was struggling with her disabilities, and she phoned them up to say, I don't want this man to come to my house. But he turned up anyway. And he told her that she had two choices for how she would die. One that was he would put her to bed, give her a drink and tablets, and put a plastic bag over her head. The other is that he would get her in the bath, she'd take some tablets, and he would push her head under the water.
Oh my God. Wow.
And he had voluminous diaries of what he had done.
And did she at that point say, oh, thank you so much for coming, but you can see yourself out? Or did he continue pushing? Because there's some cases where we've heard in Belgium where people have kind of changed their mind at the last minute, and there's been questions around whether it proceeded anyway.
It is absolutely terrifying. She basically says he is devilish, and she said she had tears in her eyes because she was convinced he had come to kill her. She gives evidence in court later. She's a witness. No one gets convicted for anything because she doesn't die. But she gives evidence from a stretcher. Such are her disabilities.
Oh God.
And imagine that. But imagine this man turns up to your house. You've told him.
And he did leave at least at that point.
He did. Well, he left. Yeah. Right. He left.
Yeah.
So they were charged with, I think, aiding and abetting or procuring a suicide in her case, but not convicted. But I think they played tapes in court of what he'd said about her, that she was this bitch because no one ever defies me.
Wow.
I mean, this is dark stuff.
That
right?
is
It's
very
really
sinister. Yeah.
dark stuff. I mean, the people who die are mostly women. They have things like multiple sclerosis. One man who decided he didn't want to die had basically what we'd call post-traumatic stress after being in the army. He had sort of serious mental health condition. He's 25, but he was approved for suicide, or very much assisted suicide.
Oh, God.
They are convicted, I think, in 6 people's deaths, or 6 people's cases, 5 of them.
Suspected in how many others?
250.
Wow. My goodness. Wow. And what became of Exit?
Well, Exit is now known as Dignity in Dying. It changed its name to Dignity.
To the voluntary youth, didn't it? I thought Dignity in Dying was the Voluntary Euthanasia Society.
It was called Voluntary Euthanasia Society and had a brief rebrand when Nicholas Reed took over. Nicholas Reed obviously was also convicted in many of these deaths, but he called it Exit, and he also published a suicide manual, which was an instruction manual on how to kill yourself, and which was found in the houses of many what we call wrongful suicides, but young women, particularly young women and elderly women. There's lots of news reporting things like tragic spinster death of women who are using this manual to kill themselves.
Oh my gosh!
And that is a manual that they published and gave to
was
society.
Was he convicted?
Yeah, so he was sentenced to a couple of years in prison, so actually sent to prison, managed to appeal it. He said he was going to take it to the European Court of Human Rights, but he managed to appeal it and get the sentence reduced. And he wasn't actually booted out of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society for a year or two. But the thing I maybe just wanted to finish on was who took over after that. So since this dark bit of our
in the 1980s,
which we've all completely memory hold, a woman took over called Barbara Smoker, and Barbara was a big deal in the humanist movement. She was like a big campaigner for free speech. She was kind of very she's South London, involved in lots of campaigns, and she on the news that her general secretary had been involving himself in the deaths of members of the public, said, this news report says there's one middle-aged agoraphobic woman. She was not terminally ill and her death could have been averted, said Miss Smoker. But in the other cases, although I can't condone one of our officers breaking the law, the fact that these people died a little bit quicker, I find a matter for rejoicing. Euthanasia means a good, easy, gentle death. Euthanasia is not killing someone. What's killing them is the disease, and we're simply cutting short that process. His compassion got the better of his discretion, she said. I mean, but these are
oh my
women with
God.
agoraphobic, women with MS.
Wow. When was that said? What year?
And so this is 1981. So this is after Nicholas Reed being sentenced to jail. But
and
she
it was
is very
essentially
interesting.
he just got too compassionate. That's all it was. His compassion was just too much. And he was never directly involved, it sounds like, in actually going to the houses. He outsourced that.
He was not involved in the means of the death. No, so that was Mark Lyons, who's this bloke who just happened to be in the basement. But in the same way that Barbara Smoker is saying, I find, is talking about these women being killed, let's be honest.
Well, being suffocated, being asphyxiated.
By someone else, yes. I mean, let's be honest. That's exactly what we're talking about. She is also in the press the very same week, and it gets into the news because of the timeliness of it, where her lodger has killed himself, and there ends up being a court hearing on this. And she obviously says, this has nothing to do with me. I know this looks a bit suspicious. But what she says is, in Exit, people we want to help in Exit are terminally ill. And the tenant, who has a history of mental illness, was not terminally ill. Now, I just think that is the most... you've literally been giving press comment to the global press about the man who leads your organisation killing members of the public who are not terminally ill. And yet, you're saying in another court, we obviously are only interested in the terminally ill. And I thought that sort of determination to try and keep it narrowly to what you think you want is the major weakness of the Assisted Dying campaign.
Can I just to be fair to Dignity in Dying, because of course there's so many organizations that have, unsavory histories, especially if they've been around a long time. Has there been any public reckoning with this, an acknowledgement of the past, we understand that harm happened in, 40 years ago, and this is not what we represent now. Has there been any public acknowledgement, reckoning?
Dignity in Dying, as they're now called. Obviously, this was some years ago. And they gave a quote. Dignity in Dying spokesman said, Dignity in Dying is a professional campaigning organisation working within the law to change the law. No one working in our organisation today was working on these issues in the 1970s or 80s, including Nicholas Reed's brief leadership of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society.
So none of us were involved
None
in
of
that,
us were working here then.
Okay.
We weren't working here then. What are we supposed to do about it? That's the message.
Interesting. Wow. So Exit became Voluntary Euthanasia Society, and Voluntary Euthanasia Society became...
So Barbara Smoker took over, binned the Exit branding because it was toxic, because, you know, they had their chairman in court with associated with suicides of a young man. The whole thing was just like messy, and so they changed it back to the Voluntary Euthanasia Society and then rebranded again as Dignity in Dying in the early noughties.
Interesting.
With a renewed public focus on the terminally ill. But like, I'm not suggesting actually that anyone in Dignity Dying would go out to someone's house and suffocate them. I mean, that is just not what we're suggesting. But the problem is, if you create a system where killing people is allowed and supported, you seem to attract fanatics. And I don't think there's any denying that Mark Lyons and Nicholas Reed were fanatics who were willing to break the law, let's be honest, kill women. And I think that is a lesson that nobody has learned. I think this has been totally memory old, and I am not surprised, to be honest, to see why, because it really harms the argument. Like, it doesn't give confidence that if we have a British version of Dignitas here, that we would somehow have the kind of responsible, moral people that we would.
Well, and even if the majority of those who are involved in, you know, pushing for law change don't want to see it expand, I think the lesson for today is there will be, and there are, groups on the fringes, individuals on the fringes who will look at every opportunity to reinterpret the language in the bill, expand the scope, push for amendments to the bill in the future. And then sometimes they don't even need to do that. They can just say, well, if you stop eating and drinking, you're going to die within a few months. And nobody can force you to eat and drink. You know, thus anyone almost can become eligible and terminally ill.
You will have people who will push the eligibility within the rules, so be careful about it. And you'll also, we have evidence now that this happened here. You have people who will push the rules far beyond any lawful interpretation of them. It's really scary.
Wow. Well, thank you, Fiona, for that wandering. I had no idea what we were going to speak about. I knew we were going to a dark place, and not quite that dark.
So I do think that this, you know, I think mercy killing has been a deliberate campaign. It's not accidental. It's not confusion on the campaigner's part. It is consistent across campaigning organisations, individuals and countries that mercy killings are, for some reason, part of their campaign. And that's very worrying, because they are not terminally ill women. They are not women who are seeking to die. And they are not women dying with a sort of gentle overdose. They are women dying in terrible violence.
And even if they are terminally ill women, maybe, you know, it doesn't mean their life and their last few months and weeks of life are not valuable.